return for a minute to the claim that disagreement over the canonical books, or even the use of other books, other non-canonical books in the 2nd and 3rd century of the church, somehow disproves the corporate reception or even the divine quality aspect of the self-authenticating model for canon. As we discussed already, the claim is usually that the corporate reception is not nearly as predominant or uniform as maybe is presented or appeared to be presented in this model. And one of the things we need to point out is that we're looking for predominant unity to begin with. We are not looking for unanimous consent. But also we need to address what the reality is in relation to the use of non-canonical books by the Church Fathers. Now, it's certainly true that oral tradition or oral sayings of Jesus circulated in the church even into the 2nd and 3rd century, and they were considered useful. And it is true that patristic fathers did cite books that were non-canonical. Both of these are true statements, but there's an assumption underlying that truth that the use of non-canonical books somehow makes them authoritative, or even that the Church Fathers had no way of knowing or distinguishing between which were authoritative and which were not. And of course that falls off on Walter Bauer's thesis that is still perpetuating today, that there was no Orthodox Christianity. But in fact, when you look at the Church Fathers and the way in which they cite these books, you find several different things. One, not the least of which being the frequency with which these books are cited is without comparison to the frequency in which the canonical books of the New Testament or even the Old Testament scriptures are cited. But secondly, even from manuscript tradition, we see that the use of the Codex as far back as the 1st century of the church was reserved, not reserved specifically for New Testament books, but that no New Testament canonical work was written on anything other than a codex, with the exception of a few texts written on a used scroll that was being reused for immediate purpose. And what that tells us is that the Christians felt that the codex itself, the grouping of manuscripts together in book form, was a way to distinguish canonical New Testament books. And what else does that tell us? Well, we have no examples in manuscript evidence of any non-canonical apocryphal New Testament work on a codex. They do not exist. There's no Gospel of Thomas in a codex. There is no Gospel of the Egyptians in a codex. And what that indicates, while not conclusive, but what it does certainly suggest, is that the earliest church was using the codex versus the scroll to distinguish between what was inspired authoritative work and what was not. Now, beyond that, we do have at least two church fathers that were rather free with the quotations of other books, of non-canonical books, and that would be Clement of Alexandria and Origen. Now, both cite from non-canonical works, but both are also insistent that the works in which they are citing are not authorized. Clement of Alexandria would quote from the Gospel of the Egyptians and the Gospel of the Hebrews and the preaching of Peter. But he would also be quick to assert that there are only 4 canonical Gospels. And even when quoting from the Gospel of the Egyptians, Clement was quick to note that what he was quoting does not correspond to the synoptic Gospels that they accept as the church. And so he downplayed the authority of the Gospel of the Egyptians. Now, Origen, in like manner, quoted from the Gospel of the Hebrews, but did the exact same thing, and downplayed the message of the Gospel of Hebrews by stating that there are only 4 canonical Gospels that we accept as from God under heaven. So even while they would cite these non-canonical works, there is this assumption that the citing of these works somehow imbues them with the same authority that would come with the canonical scriptures. And of course, it's this suggestion that just because there were other works, somehow there was no way of distinguishing between the two. And in the early church, we see that that is just not the case. And when it comes to the actual classification of books in the first, second, and third century, we learn a lot from Eusebius when he writes of 4 different categories of books that were circulating at the time. And there are the accepted or the undisputed books. Those would be the larger canonical core that we've discussed. And then there was the disputed books, books that many accepted but not all. and then there were rejected books that were unacceptable by the entire church, and then there were heretical books, books deemed as, directly contrast to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in these classifications, one of the things that we identify quite clearly is that because of those, church fathers could cite from any material they would like, and there would already be a structure developed in which the reader would identify what was authoritative and what was instructional or what was helpful but not canonical. So it is rather, I would say, rather flat and undynamic to think that just because these quotations are made that somehow the earliest church was not intelligent enough or not prepared enough to identify which ones were authoritative and which ones were not. In, of course, the undisputed books, we have roughly 22 books of the canon that were undisputed. The disputed books largely circle around James, Jude, 2 Peter, sometimes Philemon, but then 2nd and 3rd John. And, of course, these are rather fringe books. We know right off the bat that 2nd and 3rd John very likely traveled as a composite unit with 1st John. So there's some unclear certainty whether or not there was even a distinguishing factor between all three, so that when the works of John are cited, 2nd and 3rd John are likely included. But later on, we do see a little bit of discussion in Origen that they are not accepted by all, but that simply indicates that they are accepted by some, if not most. Jude and 2nd Peter, we've discussed before, they borrow from each other quite a bit. Eusebius notes that Jude's use of the Book of Enoch contributes in some way to, or likely contributed in some way to, its hesitancy with an acceptance. And of course, 2nd Peter, borrowing from Jude, brings the question of whether both are authoritative or one is a copy of the other. And so we see some dispute around these, but eventually in all circles, these 27 books, and including the ones on the external edge, were accepted. Revelation being an interesting one that was accepted early on, but then later came into question roughly the 3rd century. And of course, we should be careful to just acknowledge that I'd say Revelation has good reason to be questionable. Not because of its authority, not because of its authorship, but because of its content. Do we really want to think that the early church was willing to accept books that spoke of dragons and winged serpent locusts and horses with tails of snake tails and all these different things, and accept that without any challenge, without making certain, absolutely certain, that it was authoritative? To be honest, I'd be a lot more concerned that they didn't, and they were looking for more of that kind of literature. We'd want to put that under a test of scrutiny, and it did go under scrutiny and passed. So we see that those books did eventually get accepted. Now, the rejected books, however, never did. And of course, the rejected books, the best example would be the Shepherd of Hermas. While some considered it instructional, Shepherd of Hermas, as we've already discussed, was rejected by the Muratorian Fragment for the very reason that it was not written in the apostolic era, and so it could not be considered apostolic in origin or authoritative in message. Another example would be the Apocalypse of Peter or the Gospel of Peter, as well, two separate books, but both rejected because of their lack of apostolic authorship. And so these were rejected books. They could be quoted, but in no way would they ever be mistaken for canonical. And then there's heretical books. And of course, heretical books were deemed anything that did not correspond to the covenant message received by the people of God, Old and New Covenant. And Gospel of Thomas being the most popular of the heretical books, and it was considered a heretical book. It is not cited as scripture in any church father. It borrows excessively from the synoptic tradition, which makes it a later gospel, not within the time of the apostles. It is only 114 sayings. It is not a narrative, and therefore cannot technically be classified as a gospel. And much of the sayings are considered Gnostic or Docetic in nature, and direct contrast to the four canonical gospels that we see acknowledged from the 2nd century onward as being the only four. And so these books were never accepted as even beneficial to the church. So the modern day current argument that there were multiple gospels circulating, and I actually saw it recently stated that there were something like 400 gospels at the time, which is a completely erroneous claim. And even though there were other quote unquote gospels by the 2nd or by the 3rd century, they cannot be classified as gospels in the traditional definition as such. And it wasn't as if the church was trying to decide which were canonical at this time. And I think we provided enough evidence in this lecture series to demonstrate that. So as we mentioned early on, the self-authenticating model does actually build in the expectation of some amount of dispute. The very fact that God delivered his covenant through real-world history and real-world events with human people expects such a thing, that there will be some dispute. And so having disagreement in the canonical reception or the corporate reception of the canon is not to be unexpected, but in no way is it a defeater either. And that is the biggest message that we try to impart with this aspect of the self-authenticating model.